All right, we are looking at this book, At War with the Word, by R.V. Young, Literary Theory and Liberal Education. It's one that I asked you or offered you to, if you wished, to write essays on it, and I said, however, that it's so substantive that you might want to focus on one chapter rather than the entirety of the book. And this lecture's on the whole book. Well, it's not. I can't do it either in a lecture, or I would do a terrible job of it. So what I'm going to do is to focus on two things. First of all, the whole project of deconstruction and its fear and loathing of the Logos, as he calls it, and then to go back and look. So it'll start really focusing on chapter 3, and we'll notice some of the figures there which are somewhat surprising, namely Harold Bloom, the so-called traditionalist, defender of the canon, which I said to you he is nothing of the sort, actually. He's not in anything like a traditionalist sense. And then we'll backtrack a little bit and look at the new critical approach and how the new critical approach causes such grave offense to this tendency of literature. But I want to begin by looking at the project of deconstruction, because the project of deconstruction is the one that is so inimical to literary studies, I think. But it has come into the academy, and its strategies and its tendencies are shared by literary theories that are not identified with deconstruction. But it's the primary deconstructive theorists, namely Jacques Derrida and Paul de Man I haven't talked about, just because we can't talk about everything on the course, but they have rooted their ideas in writers like Martin Heidegger, whom we have talked about, so his view of what language is, and secondarily with Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's telling that Heidegger spends much of his later career as a philosopher expositing Friedrich Nietzsche. He spends 4 volumes, I believe, talking about Nietzsche and his significance. So the linguistic turn, so-called, which we associated with Heidegger, I suggested, or the so-called ontological turn, is problematic for our view of what language is and what it does. It's no longer representational as it used to be. In philosophy, they call it a theory of truth, correspondence theory of truth, correspondence between our words and the reality. In literary studies, we don't talk about a correspondence theory of truth, but that's what's going on. Traditional language does. Our words correspond to things. They identify it in some way. They say real things about it. And Heidegger's view of language is different than that. It doesn't acknowledge a reality, reflect it. Rather, words come out of their hiddenness. So the truth is I use this terrible German word, which really can't be translated, but it's Unverborgenheit. I'll just put it up, because my accent, Borgenheit, which I will translate saying it's untranslatable, because it's not, and hiddenness. It's unhiddenness. Well, what the heck is unhiddenness? As I say, it's not translatable. It's because it doesn't make sense in German either. But he's translating the Greek word aletheia, which he says is the A there is the alpha privativum. It's the privation of something that's hidden or forgotten. So it's something like revelation. So something discloses itself to us, and language does that. But it doesn't disclose. It's not a word that describes a thing or relates to it, and it's not an idea, an intellectual concept in our mind, which the word then expresses to other minds and comprehends. So there isn't that mind or the intellect there behind it. It's rather the word discloses itself. So it becomes very impersonal. Not to mention being opposed to the idea of this correspondence theory of language, which is the traditional one. So with Nietzsche in the background and Heidegger in the foreground, these literary theorists then proceed. So chapter 3, I'm just going to outline and to some degree read what R.V. Young says here and put things together for you and to some degree comment and summarize what is being said here. I think the book is excellent. And at this point in the course, I think we've done enough before it that you should be able to understand what he's saying and see and get a sense of how different and problematic the modern literary theory is for the study of literature. And not just for the study of literature, for the humanities in general. So with that said, the project of deconstructing Western metaphysics, which deconstruction purports to do. So this is why Derrida was received with such hostility in the academy. Although he was doing what he called literary theory or deconstruction, he didn't confine himself to the study of literary texts. He was interested in literary texts because literary texts are more, they use metaphor more frequently. They're more elusive in their understanding. They don't say things in the scientific manner of just naming something and speaking in a linear fashion. They often use allegory, they use different schemes and tropes. There is often irony, there are hidden meanings and so forth. And those sorts of texts, he says, are better at revealing what's true of all language. So he goes to literature to demonstrate a case that he says is ultimately accurate across the board. And it's very difficult to actually name anything and to establish its being. And so it's an attack on being, or ontotheology, as he calls it. Now, I'll come to that in a minute. But the project of deconstructing Western metaphysics is Derrida's. Now, what Young notes, and he's correct in this, is that although Derrida gets the credit for it, or claims to be establishing a new thing, where his real genius lies is not in bringing out a new idea, but really being a publicity hound. He presents it well and speaks of it unambiguously, but the figure that does it more consistently and more powerfully is Nietzsche. Now, I would go back even further myself, and I already have, and I said that the problem lies in Immanuel Kant when he inverted reason and understanding. Right? I won't use the blue one, I'll use the black one if I've got it here. Hopefully it'll appear better. So historically, what he calls Verstand, in English understanding, in Latin intellectus, was superior to reason, Vernunft. It gave us the footholds with which we could understand other things. So to use more contemporary jargon, it gave us the presuppositions that allowed us to see things. You have to have certain certainties in place in order to even talk about things. And one of the certainties is that language makes sense. It has to have a meaning. So the idea of the logos is central to the whole Western intellectual project. So you have to assume that language is meaningful and that your ideas make sense. They can be contradicted and even refuted through logic, etc. Those are sort of things that we are required to assume in order then to apply reasoning. But Kant inverts the two and makes reason the superior faculty and subjects understanding to the findings of reason. And because of that, he says that metaphysics is impossible. And with that, we can't really know God, and so forth. Whereas previous ages would have said we need God. It's a necessary assumption merely to hold things together, even. Never mind believing in God per se, although that's obvious and necessary. But that's just for the sheer ability to articulate ourselves and to find and assume meaning, we have to assume God. But when Kant inverts this and puts it's not Vernunft, it's Vernunft, by the way, inverts this and puts reason above understanding. Now there's nothing left of understanding that reason hasn't dictated. And reason is a sword that will cut through everything. And so Nietzsche comes on the back of Kant and the Copernican turn of subjectivity. And with that, he observes, and he doesn't like Kant. He says he's a horrible spider with his own metaphysical systems. He calls him that, a horrible spider, which I always remember and like, because Kant is notoriously difficult. But Nietzsche follows on with this, and here's Nietzsche's project. It is observing that language is really never establishing the being of anything, but it's an activity of the will, or as Nietzsche calls it, the will to power. And in that, he's probably following on Schopenhauer as well, who wrote a book in the early 19th century called The World as Will and Representation. So the world is an articulation or expression of our will. It's a representation of just pure willfulness. But under Nietzsche, this becomes an explicit project. It's not in Kant. I think Kant lays the foundation for this. Nietzsche then follows on with this, and that becomes his whole project, is to express the will that is no longer grounded in anything, not in humanity. If you ever read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it gives this concept which is often referred to of the Übermensch. And I think I talked about this in this class, what this strange word means. It doesn't really mean anything in regular German either. But in the Swiss Alps, the Übermensch is the man at the top of, have you ever seen them when they scale the side of a mountain? There are two connected by a rope, right? And the guy at the top is hammering in the whatever you call them, the pegs into the side of the cliff. And then there's a guy down below him and the guy at the top is the Übermensch, the top man. And so he is leading progress, and he's connected to nothing. Everyone's connected to him. We Untermenschen are connected to the Übermensch, and the Übermensch is going upwards by his own means and by his own power and by his own will. And so the great man, it's often translated as Superman. It's a bad translation, by the way. Not just because it evokes a man in red and blue tights and stuff like that and a cape, but because really the image of somebody climbing a mountain face connected to nothing except his own power is essential to this, and everyone else is connected to him and his power. So Nietzsche wants to be released from the shackles of tradition and Christianity and ontology and other people's thinking. He thinks that it's good, it's progress. And one of the things that he wants to get rid of is the idea of metaphysics, because metaphysics is going to constrain or limit the possibilities for the Übermensch, and the Übermensch will not be constrained by anything. That's precisely what makes him an Übermensch. Otherwise, he'd just be a mensch like you and I. And he talks about Christianity, by the way, being the philosophy of a slave. The idea of being a servant is to Nietzsche abhorrent, leads to a disgusting ethics. So under Nietzsche, being is alienated from action and reason from language. And I'll just read directly from Jung's formulation here because I think it's quite good. The word, or logos, through whom all things were made, according to the fourth gospel and the Nicene Creed, is alienated from the creation. That is, the world ceases to be patterned after wisdom, and reality loses its nature. This dismantling of our metaphysical grip on reality is not without practical consequences, as Nietzsche subsequently points out by invoking the slogan of the invincible society of assassins. Quote, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." Here we have real freedom, for the notion of truth itself has been disposed of. So there's freedom from all limitation, and it's the will to power of this man who is going to be brave enough to transcend social norms and traditional understandings. Even of human nature, he's going to transcend his own nature. It's not just that he does it willy-nilly, he intentionally seeks to do so. He's the quintessential rebel, very popular in the academy. So any notion of rational authority and authority over him, that would be the Übermensch, he has to discount. The idea of a God, no. That would make me subordinate, and that would prevent me from being the man I'm supposed to be. It would limit my autonomy. Again, you can see the Enlightenment's view of autonomy in here. The autonomy, it would be no autonomy were I to acknowledge God. Now, contemporary nihilism, like Sartre, will also see God in the same sense, as this oppressor of his being that he can't accept, because to accept God would be to be annihilated. He would have nothing. If God were, he wouldn't be. So any notion of rational authority or wisdom, Nietzsche simply discounts. Reason is the servant of desire's restless energy. Now, they get this from the Romantics as well, and they will also get it from Heraclitus, who one of the Greek pre-Socratic philosophers, who talks about the forces, the primal forces of the world being war and love, or strife and love. So it's desire and power. William Blake, in his poetry, speaks about this all the time. Right? The primal thing. So, and I talked about that bridge in Toronto, Queen's Street, going across the Don River from Toronto proper over into East York. And it says, the stream in which I step is not the same stream I entered, because everything's in flux, says Heraclitus. Nothing. So it's all becoming, and it's nothing is. There's nothing in a state of being. Everything's in a state of becoming. It's all action. There's no stasis. There's nothing true. There's nothing solid. There's nothing real. Everything's becoming. Now, Nietzsche is the modern exponent of this, and the best modern exponent of it. But this is an old debate in the Pre-Socratic school, because they want to be fair to the Pre-Socratics, they want to account for two things in human experience that we know to be true in some ways. One, that things are always changing. So that's Heraclitus, his observation, that there's a constant change in the universe, which explains death, among other things. On the other hand, there's also an awareness that there's a sense of solidity to things, which Parmenides suggests. So he says Parmenides thinks that the ultimate reality is being. Right? So the two are... And what they want to account for is the fact that in Parmenides' case, that there's a oneness to everything. There's a unity to it, a being. There's something that unites everything. Well, it exists. That's the common ground. Or it has a creator, if you want to use Christian language. But even before Christian understanding, there was an Aristotelian notion that there was a causal agent, and everything existed as a consequent and acted. So there's a oneness, Parmenides, by the way. There's a oneness to all things. On the other hand, there's also a sense of diversity or multiplicity. There's not just one thing, there are many things. So the Pre-Socratics are struggling with these two things. Here they're one, and here there's more than one. There are many. And this is a problem in the ancient world, in the philosophical world, by the way. And they can't solve the problem. Why does it seem like there's a unity to all things? On the other hand, why does there seem like ultimate reality is there are multiple realities? Right? Under this multiplicity, we could put Heraclitus, but we could also put Democritus, who's the atomistic philosopher. ultimate reality is in terms of atoms. There are many. How many? An infinite number. But if there's this, then there can't be that. And if there's this, then there can't be that. This is resolved in the Trinity, by the way, where ultimate reality is both one and many. Each is equally ultimate. They are both true. Not possible in this conception. There's only one God. There are also three persons of the Godhead. Now, this is not possible in this. Now, that unification is key in the progress of Western thought and allows for modern science, which the ancient Greeks made no progress in. They had a certain standard, but they didn't go beyond that. The ancient Greeks, for all their greatness, and there is greatness there, never really were able to put together how things could be both one and many, but it's the doctrine of the Trinity that allowed for that. But I'm getting a little off topic here. But Nietzsche is insisting not on the oneness of things, rather, but the multiplicity of things and the infinite change in things. So he's fitting in with a broad, long tradition. By the way, I said to you already that Karl Marx wrote his doctoral thesis on Democritus, who's an atomist. He's a materialist, the earliest materialist. There are things. The only thing they have in common is that they're things. But otherwise, there's no unity. There's infinite diversity. So, by the way, in modern democratic thought, that pluribus et unum in the United States is an understanding that both are there. So it's not one or the other. In ancient political philosophy, there would be the sense that Caesar is Lord. He is everything, and human life matters not in that case. So there's significant human rights connotations of this. In China, in our day, what the Chinese state wishes is all important. The people can be sacrificed to it. Likewise, in Nazi ideology, the same sort of thing. By the way, if you lean on this end or on this end, you get the same outcome. The fact that we bear the imago Dei, each individual bears the image of God, and yet there is a God who's distinct from each individual image, allows for both the one and the many. And it gives you an integrity as a person that you otherwise lack, and which no political system outside of Christianity has ever permitted. And it allows for differences of opinion and dispute and so forth. It allows for freedom, in other words, because neither of these is ultimate on its own. They're both equally ultimate. Anyway, I'm moving into political theory here anyway, but it's really interesting. So Nietzsche, the consequence of Nietzsche is that any notion of rational authority or wisdom, he just discounts. Reason is the servant of desire's endless energy. So Blake says that that desire is never to be impeded, even when it's hostile. So think about the lamb and the lion. They're both expressions of divine being, and both of them are good for Blake. One's not. So innocence and experience, they're both good. They're just expressions of energy. But deconstruction is the effort of reason, as Jung says, to devour itself, and hence the limits or constraints that rationality necessarily discovers in the finite human condition. And I think this is a really key point, and that's why I do it at this point on the course, because we're going to, when we come to the 1960s and follows, we'll find arguments that arise between the Marxists and the feminists and the new historicists and the neo-Freudians and the identity political positions, all of it, and they will be arguing with one another, but all of them are united in a virulent anti-humanism. The idea that there is no human nature. They are united in their belief that human nature is something that has to be got rid of because it's normative. And if it's normative, then it's a restraint on their desire to be Übermenschen. Right? If there's a common unifying human nature that will be common to all of the diversity of these various identity groups which we want to represent, then that will be a limit on our expression. And they desire autonomy from all normativity. So post-1960s, as I say, the title of the book is At War with the Word, but remember, we're made in Imago Dei, and Jesus is the Word of God. And so language is itself a sort of a casualty in the war on the divine logos, I think. And then that it spills into the academy. So I'll just read his summary here. Despite the rancorous altercations amongst Marxists, feminists, new historicists, neo-Freudians, in every position across the ideological spectrum, all are united in a virulent anti-humanism that despises the concept of human nature precisely as the image and likeness of God. That is, as man's rationality is the sign of his participation in the divine order, in the Logos. So they will attack anyone that wants to defend reasoning and the capacity for reasoning and appeals to logic. You'll hear this from my colleagues in the philosophy department. This is a key issue. They're right, it's a key issue. But what's really at stake isn't the debate over reason, it's the debate over the person that uses reasoning. It's an attack on the image of God. In its relentless attack upon the ontotheology or the logocentrism, both of which Derrida uses, and so do his successors. So, ontotheology, or more frequently, logocentrism. This is the one that Derrida more frequently uses. He is an anti-logocentrist. In the relentless attack upon ontotheology and logocentrism of the Western tradition, deconstruction currently provides the common factor among the divergent manifestations of secularized man's recoil from the Logos as the pattern of normative rationality. Now that's a mouthful. But the whole idea of norms, that's the point. Or normal. Note there is a revulsion if you suggest that there's something that's normal in our discourse. People will go wild if you say that's not normal. There's a shudder or even a scream of outrage. Then that's really what the issue. It's not that they reject your version of normal, but rather that there is a norm even, of any sort. Because to do that would be to be subjecting it to a logical, coherent, and limited understanding. And that is exactly what the Übermensch seeks to overcome in his self-expression, or her self-expression, or their self-expression, or whatever you want to say. But it's the overcoming of a limitation on the self. So in Immanuel Kant, as I said to you, when he writes on what is enlightenment, and he talks about in terms of autonomy, so the liberation from the self-imposed tutelage to the past and to the authorities, and therefore its motto is sapere aude, dare to know, he says. Dare to know. We're going to seek to do that, and Nietzsche likewise, same spirit. He, at that point in human history, is still assuming the validity of the Imago Dei. He's not yet attacked it per se. But 200 years after Kant, literary theory is doing precisely that. So now it is and C.S. Lewis describes it in that book, The Abolition of Man, right? And he says that as soon as the sciences were used to exercise power over nature, and power was delivered over the natural world, right? Baconian science. But come the mid-19th century, the target of the power becomes human nature itself. And at that point, we're sawing the branch off on which we're standing. And that's what he calls the human sciences, or he doesn't call it, I call it that. But That's when psychology and anthropology and sociology and all of these social sciences, which he describes as being the conditioners, those that want to condition human nature, to change it, to alter it, to make it better. We can call it transhumanism. We're going on the course to talk about transhumanism and posthumanism, which is probably the furthest extreme in it. Although I thought it was, and then I found out the other day that ahumanism is now the latest. So there's a scholar in the UK. I'll give you a link. I'm not sure we're going to read her work, but she wants to get rid of the delusion and be the Übermensch of the Übermenschen. The next level, we're going, for the sake of the planet, we're going to have to accept that even annihilating human nature is a respectable goal. Because it's speciesism to insist that human nature is superior to other things, right? So it's almost explicit. And if you read That Hideous Strength from C.S. Lewis, that's exactly what's going on. So ultimately, the war on the Word ends up being a war on the human beings who are in the image of the Word, and a war on language and rationality. But ultimately, once they've shot at one another and shot one another, the last person that gets shot is the one who is doing the shooting. Then they shoot themselves in the head. Because it's a wholly negative project. There is no purpose to it other than to destroy. If you want to look on page 1661 in At War with the Word, do this on your own. He notes that the word logos, if you go to the Little Scott, which is the great classical dictionary, the word logos, it takes 3 double column pages, very fine print, to explain what the logos means in Greek. And it has 2 strands. One's the Greek strand and the other's the Hebrew strand. I think I've talked about this in maybe the Bible is literature. I don't think I did it on this course. But from the Greek world, where there's ideas of ground or ration or the foundation for something, reason and discourse. Those are sort of Greek conceptions. The Hebrew conceptions of logos are the idea of the word and the wisdom of God. Those all flow into this word logos. So the anti-logocentrism of Jacques Derrida is an attack on all of those things, the foundation of Western thought. And Nietzsche then, I think, assumes the abolition of man, by the way. So in his work, Beyond Good and Evil, have you heard of this if you haven't read it? What he's articulating there is that good and evil are concepts which are entirely subjective and we can simply dismiss. If we're going to be the Übermensch, then we have to get beyond the limitations that are suggested by a moral framework of good and evil. That's an articulation of the abolition of man before C.S. Lewis writes The Abolition of Man. And Jung's comment is correct. Nietzsche is necessarily the enemy of all norms and standards, not, mind you, of this or that law or rule, but the idea of the normative, even of the normal. And a further consequence, and this one's important to me, I think, is that Nietzsche must be the enemy of meaning. For to have meaning is to have significance. That is, to bear a sign. Significance. The FIC here, it gets translated from facra to bear a sign. It's not facra, to make a sign. So to have meaning is to have significance, that is to bear a sign, to be marked, to be this thing and not another, to be distinguished from and placed in relation to other things. The meaning of an entity is thus the basis of its identity, which entails definition, discrimination, judgment. It's intellectual law and order. In other words, intellectual, remember I talked about the intellect. This is the law and order. You have to subvert understanding with reason first before you can subvert intellectual law and order. So this is a long project that gets more and more radical and more extreme as time gets by. But I think it's an inevitable outcome, given that. So if you change the definition of something, and this was said by conservatives when the idea of same-sex marriage was floated. We'll allow gay couples to marry as well, and then there were some basically not very helpful responses in the sense that, well, that's disgusting, whatever. The broader issue is that to redefine it between a man and a woman isn't just you can't just put two things in there. The two were essential parts. To remove them allows for the possibility of polygamy. Because it's not just that there are two. Why two then? Why is two normative? Why not three? Why not 10? Why two human beings? Why can't it be a person and an animal or whatever? Like why the normativity of two persons? So you've decided that the sexual distinction between the two which constituted marriage was irrelevant. But why is that going to be the only thing that has to go? Because why number then? Why is number so important? And the answer is it isn't. Once you've got rid of the idea of the normative, then anything goes. That's really the thrust of the issue. That was my objection to it. You can make other objections as well, but that was the key principle, is it's getting rid of a norm. And the new thing is not then normal, or its claim to normativity is not very well established. And the idea of two being the issue is less important than two complementary opposites that can have children to procreate. That seems to me sort of important. So at any rate, but once the definition is altered, then judgment will go with it. So then the laws will also change, and they'll have to change, and they'll have to change in manifold ways, in ways that are even unintended consequences. Because what we're doing at this point is changing the overall pattern in how we view reality and live within that reality. As soon as you change a definition, particularly a core definition, particularly one that for Christians is defining not only the relations of a man and a woman in a family and what the core of a family unit, but also the relations between Christ and his church, the husband-bride issue, right? All of those things are altered in the process. So Jung's phrase, to know these distinctions, in general, whatever is normative, and to know the reason that unites them in an overall pattern is to know reality. And the actual nature of reality is then the truth. So you can't just willy-nilly call it something different to accommodate without changing the nature of the reality and the reality that you live in, and the consequences are quite large, not small. But if your view of language is that of, as we saw, Saussure, all language works in an arbitrary fashion anyway, so there is no normativity. There's just binary oppositions. And the binary oppositions are connected with the ontotheology or the logocentrism. And so it's the project of contemporary deconstructive theory and its successors to deconstruct the binary nature of all things, which is sort of a hard thing to do, because it doesn't just go down to male-female, it goes down to water-land and black and white. I mean, binary code functions because it's a form of language in which there are two opposite things. There's a 1, which is something, and a 0, which is no number. It's not a different number. It's literally nothing. You get into the theory of what 0 means. Philosophically, what is nothing? It's not just another number. It's the lack of a number. At any rate, so when we change a norm and we ignore the distinction, we ignore the reason that unites them and the overall pattern, and at that point we change the reality, and therefore we are affecting the truth. And then he says, the central religious tradition of the West, namely Christianity, teaches that knowledge of the truth is freedom. Key point. And the truth shall set you free. It's living in reality as it actually is. This is one of the, and of course, one benefits from living in reality. What's the problem with paganism? What's the problem with idolatry? It's that they're worshiping a false god, yes, but what is the consequence of that? It's horrific depravity, destruction of human nature, the limitation on human flourishing, the sacrifice of infants or the weak or your enemies. You have to slaughter them. So to live in reality, that is what freedom means. There's a flourishing that comes from acknowledging the truth, the reality of the way things are. So religion isn't just for the religious, it's for everyone. Everyone benefits from having a true notion of what reality is. In my view, that of human nature is dependent on the fact that God himself has some version of a personal nature, where he is the person from whom our personhood derives. So he says, but Nietzsche teaches to the contrary, that truth is an obstacle to real freedom. So truth must go, and all of the connotations that go with it. For if truth exists, if things have meaning and purpose, if they have ontological integrity, then everything is not permitted. And as he said, everything is permitted. But if we accept that there is such a thing as truth and falsehood, there must be things that are not permitted. That is the false. We have to say that you can't do that. I can't give you 100% on your test because it was wrong. And I can't do that. I'm limiting your freedom. You'll object. Now, the contribution of Derrida in this is to make Nietzsche's call for intellectual anarchy into a viable academic research project. That's what he did. And what was the logos, the thing in which all things held together, is that Colossians 1 verses 15 to 20. Have a look at that on your own time. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, in whom all things hold together, etc. So that central logos, upon which all of our logoi, our words, depend, is being displaced or superseded by freedom. Derrida calls it free play, but it's Nietzsche's freedom. It's freedom from the limitations of words. So it's not a frontal assault on metaphysics. It's a subversion of metaphysics from within. So he's using the academy as a way of evacuating words of meaning, whether that's his intention or not. And what's really interesting about it, and I really do think it's interesting, is that the people that are most offended by Derrida are actually those who are from the secular humanistic tradition. Because his attack is on the claim of people to make truth claims of their own. So in the Kantian tradition. So they hate Derrida. Whereas my response to Derrida, my supervisor is a deconstructionist, by the way, wrote a good book on Derrida, Heidegger, and Blanchot. Timothy Clark, very bright man, good guy. His argument, and one that I agree with, is the deconstruct. He didn't make this point. This is my point here. But deconstruction has truth to it. Human claims to truth are limited and provisional, and the claim for absolute truth from human beings is grounded ultimately in nothing. This is where we part ways. I say that's true. So the whole Enlightenment project, which Kant expresses most coherently, is making claims on the basis of truth that we have no capacity to make. If you see what I mean. So reality, you can say, well, let's try this thought experiment, rather than our words conforming to a world outside of us and saying that that's real and that's true, etc. Let's see if reality conforms to our capacity to perceive it. And we'll call that project the project of reason. Okay, but why would I assume that what you say there is true? It seems to me he gets rid of the whole world of the visible world, and it all becomes an intellectual exercise. They don't relate to things outside of us. But why should I regard that as true? I say he doesn't. So what Derrida does for me is to deconstruct the Enlightenment project. But it says nothing about Christianity. Because Christianity was never based on human words, it was based on the divine word, on revelation. So this is why I'm quite emphatic on the importance of the inerrancy of Scripture and the authority of Scripture. These are key issues. I give not 1 inch on these issues precisely because without that, this is the bulwark upon which everything breaks. All of these academic schools and so forth, they're all attacking the primacy of the word and the authority of the word. Give no ground on that. Never give ground on these fronts, actually. Never. Not 1 inch. Because to do that is to live in unreality then. To admit that, well, I'm trying to figure things out for myself. Well, I am trying to figure things out for myself. But I find that I know true things when I trust that God's revealed them and I live in accordance with his terms of understanding, which human nature is one of those, by the way. It's a legacy of the patristic period, ideas of the Trinity, the one and the triune nature of God and the divine human person. So Jesus was fully God and he was fully human. And we bear the Imago Dei. These have huge implications that if I hold to be true, then it will affect how I treat everybody else and myself. Because if it's true and I bear the Imago Dei, then everything about me is important and meaningful. And it matters to God. And it ought to matter. So my life is filled with meaning. The world is filled with meaning. If it's not true, or if it's just my hypothesis about it, then it might be true, it might not be true. I happen to think if I make it up, it's not very likely to be true. Anyway, let me move on from that. Is that more or less clear? Let's move on to Mr. Harold Bloom. When I looked at Bloom, I suggested that Bloom was being attacked, and he was, in the 80s by feminist critics, the post-colonialists, and so with a variety of what he called the schools of resentment, who he said have no love or even taste for literature. They want to seemingly destroy it. He hated this about them. They had no appreciation, no desire for it, and so he wrote this book, Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human and the Western Canon. So he sounds like a defender of the canon, but what form is his defense of the canon? Here's what Jung's argument is, and I agree with the argument. This is why I've given you the book. Harold Bloom, quote, page 69, takes essentially the same data as the deconstructionists and constructs the most aggressive and robustly self-aggrandizing critical practice of our time. If knowledge fails, as the deconstructionist says it does, there is always sheer will, the drive to psychic power and satisfaction. And Bloom is an avowed modern Gnostic. So I said he's a secular or atheistic Jew. Actually, he's a Gnostic. He even writes a book on Gnosticism. Says it's the quintessential American religion. And it might be. Bloom is an avowed modern Gnostic who regards gnosis, knowledge, knowing, more as a matter of freedom to dominate than as knowledge in the traditional sense. And here's the quote. Freedom in a poem must mean freedom of meaning, the freedom to have a meaning of one's own. Such freedom is wholly illusory unless it is achieved against a prior plenitude of meaning, which is tradition, and so also against language. So what he means by this, his defense of the canon, is a defense for him to be himself, to aggrandize himself. So he even talks about, in one of his books, which is a sort of a neo-Freudian approach, the anxiety of influence. He talks about how this is Bloom, how the Romantic authors were all anxious of their comparison to the great John Milton, and it affected them, and part of their motivation was to kill the father, as it were, sort of a Freudian thing. I want to kill my father and take his place. So they want to be better than Milton. It's a sort of a psychological motivation for it. Similarly, that's what motivates Bloom. Let no man restrain me. It's also, by the way, William Blake. He says, I will not accept another man's system. That's a form of slavery. I will think for myself. In the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, the Proverbs of Hell. Have a look at them sometime. It's the same idea. So freedom is only freedom when it throws off everything, including the tradition. So this is a pretty odd position for somebody defending the Western canon, right? But as I say, but Bloom is a Gnostic. And Gnosticism has always cozied up and been comfortable being connected with Christianity. So Elaine Pagels, who writes the Gnostic Gospels, will articulate similar sorts of claims. And I'm going to come towards the end to talk about Gnosticism. I'm going to go back to the beginning of this book and deal with his suggestions at the outset there. But he sees that the whole project of criticism and poetry, furthermore, is conflict and crisis. By the way, these are Heraclitan terms, this love and strife. It's a project of jealousy. It's projected jealousy and the death drive, the horror and the allure of incest. Quote from Mr. Bloom. The final source of poetry is the same for Bloom as it is for Paul de Man, the deconstructionist. All literature is the alternative to a terrified howl of anguish in the face of mortality, the emptiness of the abyss. Anyway, that's on page 70. You can have a look at this. And here's the quote that directly allies him with Gnosticism. Page 71, poetry and criticism alike usurp strength. Only by invoking the language of desire, possession, and power, and such language to me seems inevitably the language of gnosis. Think of the Emperor in the Star Wars trilogy. Episode 2, unlimited power, right? It's Gnosticism. Limitless power or something like that. Or is it the third one? I think it might be the third one. Right? Am I wrong? You probably know them better than I. So Bloom wants to construct, through Gnostic theorizing, a realistic account of the human condition, which is at odds with Orthodox Judaism as well as Christianity. Because, of course, in Orthodox Judaism, God is ultimate reality himself, and he reveals himself in words. The importance of the word in Jewish understanding is primal, right? It's what distinguishes their God from the pagan gods. Their God speaks. The pagan gods are dumb, they're mute, they can't speak. The prophets of Baal have to cut themselves and they cry out to Baal. And then they're mocked by Elijah, maybe he's sleeping. And so they continue to slash him, right? Anyway. But that idea that God reveals himself in the Word, and the importance of the Word, and words, very central to Orthodox Judaism and also to Christianity. And in both cases, by the way, the Muslims call Christians and Jews the people of the book. That's central. The Muslims are not the people of the book, by the way. That's how they call the Christians and the Jews. Historically speaking. So the Freudian view of the unconscious is substituted for the concept of original sin in Bloom. And instead of human nature being understood as fallen, to be fallen is held to be our nature. And to be abnormal is the norm. So if this all sounds a little perverse, well, it's probably because it is. But it's an odd thing. And I think Bloom, when he got into this debate with the other critical theories of his day, I think he just enjoyed the fight because it was expressing his status as an Übermensch then, right? He's going to fight them all down. He was not going to bend to their howls and cries and claims of being marginalized and suppressed and so forth. He was going to show them no mercy. Called the schools of resentment. So he shares in common with the deconstructionist, does Bloom then, a distaste for the creaturely status of human beings, the limitations. He wants to transcend them through the act of the will, like Nietzsche's Übermensch. He's not really if you read Bloom as a critic interpreting literature, he's not very profound. I don't find. And what you see is more his will to impose, or his desire in his writing to impose his will upon a text which is sort of recalcitrant. It doesn't want to give way to it, but he's going to force the meaning into it. You'll read a lot of critics that do that now. You read what they write, and you say, what does this have to do with the text? And the answer is it has nothing to do with it. And they're proud of that fact. That's the whole point. So this is a bad reading. It doesn't help me read it. No, but it's the person expressing their own will within that, which they find liberating again. So it's really, so then it's fundamentally a religious exercise. This is why there's the culture wars within the academy are very strong and hot, because it really is almost a religious exercise. So let me go to comments or questions at this stage, and then I go to the backtrack and talk about the new criticism a bit and why it is such a target for all these other literary schools. No? Okay, then I'll go to it. So the new critics view the text as having a sort of autonomy itself. This is sort of interesting. Remember I said the Enlightenment talks about human nature having autonomy. The self, the law of the self. We are unto ourselves a law. Right? We don't have a lawgiver that legislates our nature. We're free from all that. We're going to be autonomous beings. By the way, autonomy and individuality are not the same thing. They're often conflated. Sometimes somebody means by individuality autonomy and vice versa. But an individual, in its Latin sense, is just one of a species. Right? There's an individual, and then there's the species to which you belong. I'm an individual human being, as are you. But autonomy is that there's nobody like me. I'm unique. I'm a special, I don't want to say snowflake, but it came to mind, a special snowflake. Right? There's no one like me. Every snowflake is unique, but every human being is not unique in that sense. But in autonomy, that is. But the new critics understand the text in such terms. So it has an autonomy. It has a nature, and that we engage with it, and we have to recognize it on its own terms. We can't impose our own reading onto it. So that's the view of the text that the new critics present, that we have to read. So we're not interested in the context that surrounds the text. We're not interested in the subtext, whether it's Freudian or otherwise. We're interested in the text. And we have to take it on its own terms, not to impose our views on it. And that, of course, then would suggest that the text is the norm. Furthermore, or there's a normativity of the text. It has a legitimacy there on its own without us giving it a legitimacy. And good literary texts have a deep richness to them that will speak to us in some ways, but they insist on the autonomy of the text. But note, they're using the same language as the Enlightenment here. And to some degree, I think there's a few problems with that view. But at any rate, they are using that term. So, new criticism and their idea that the text has autonomy is condemned not because it treats the literary work as an empty form, which is sometimes what its critics say. It's because they say, well, you're taking a text and you're saying that history doesn't matter, and form doesn't matter, and biography doesn't matter, and culture doesn't matter. You're saying none of those, it's just purely autonomous. This is ridiculous. We don't live in a world like that, so charge the critics. But that's not the real objection. The real objection is that it understands literary form in a way that undermines the materialist ideologues, because there's a resistance to their theories there. Because they don't see it simply as a form. The text is not just a form, it's a structure of significance. It has, and there's the key word, it signifies something. It has meaning. And that meaning is not reducible. It can't just be deconstructed. So hence the view of the text of the new critic, which is presented by them to be meaningful and worthy of study, their critics are all after them for it. So I guess in some ways I would be like a new critic in that sense. In the way I teach my classes, I teach Shakespeare. Let's look at Shakespeare's work. What's he trying to say here? Let's look at his language. Let's look at his worldview. But note that even when I do it, and I think I am to some degree a new critic, I will talk about the history. I'll talk about the form in which it is, whether it's a comedy or a tragedy or whatever, or history. I'll talk about some of the biographical details, although I don't find them that important for Shakespeare per se, because it's really hard to know what even Shakespeare thought, because he presents every character seemingly sympathetically in some ways. They seem like live characters, just like Charles Dickens do. They're wonderful characters that jump off the page. So it's really hard to know, is he a Catholic or is he a Protestant? Or is he a secular humanist, as later writers? To me, to some extent, he's clearly a Christian. Look at his worldview. I mean, broadly speaking, does he have a personal relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ? Who knows? Whatever. It's the wrong question almost to ask. It wouldn't be the wrong question to ask him. It's the wrong question to ask the texts. Right? It's just not relevant. So they look at the text as a structure of significance, and it embodies a human experience furthermore. And that embodiment of human experience is so intricate and artful and elusive and careful and well designed that it enriches us and our own understanding of ourselves. It gives us a sense of the meaning of our lives. So you come out of that living lives that you never had the opportunity to live. We live in Canada. You can live the lives of somebody who was in the 16th century and writes about people who were in the ancient world and so forth as well. And there's a sense of what T.S. Eliot talked about, the great tradition, right? You're not just reading this text, you're also to some degree in a dialogue with all the other texts. And I'll just go on and read this because I don't want to interrupt Mr. Young here. By virtue of capturing experience in a verbal form and abstracting it from the flow of time, in other words, by creating aesthetic distance, the literary work of art furnishes unique and invaluable access to experience via contemplation and commentary. Far from evincing a lack of interest in history and the human condition, this view of literature, in fact, strengthens the relation between the author and history by treating the literary work as a portal into the meaning of the ceaseless currents of the historical process. That's a very academic sentence. Do you follow it? It's a bit of a mouthful. Precisely insofar as it transcends the particular biases and individual purposes of its author, the immediate expectations and assumptions of its original or any other readers, and the political trends and socioeconomic circumstances of its era, the work of literature is a testimony to the inherent significance and purpose of human life. So the question of what does it mean to us becomes more meaningful when we reject it has to be immediately relevant to me, because now it talks about the ubiquitous and universal meaning of a text. It's seemed meaningful throughout all eras. As soon as we say it has to be understandable and acceptable on our terms, we're limiting how meaningful it actually is. And some texts stand the test of time in this way. And they gain greater validity. They're the ones we want to go back and keep reading. And now the contrast. While traditional humanist scholars, especially literary critics, saw themselves as being engaged in a dialogue with a work of human intellect and imagination, postmodernist academics shed the traditional reverent attitude of the humanities in their hunger for a clinical indifference of the human sciences. That's his quote. It sounds like me, but it's him. Right? Literature as an institution is to be regarded, along with other forms of discourse, as a phenomenon. Works of literature are to be treated less as masterpieces than as specimens. Right? We don't have to find delight in it. We don't have to find, oh, this is beautiful, this is splendid. It doesn't make your heart sing. It's like you're supposed to be detached, clinical, and different. Human activities, including literature, have no inherent meaning. Meaning is rather given in some arbitrary fashion through the systems or codes of the institution, which is itself a construct. So the university is a construct, not a feature of human nature. It doesn't reflect the idea that all things hold together in Christ, which is the university is a medieval institution, by the way. It's not there in the ancient world. But all things are comprehended in it, and they are all interconnected. And if you want to understand C.S. Lewis's works, you have to understand that he thinks that all the time. So every little minute thing is connected to other things. There's a big picture with the little one. The unity and the multiplicity, the diversity and the unity, and they are always interplayed. Whereas if you view that language as a social construct or as something that is amenable to changes over time that will contradict the idea of a universal human nature, you're going to hate this view of the text. So here's the final point, and the most important point. And I'm just going to read. This is pages 14 and 15. Although the language and tone of the current university setting. Now, when did he write this again? This is a while ago, but not that long ago. 1999, first printing. So it is a fair wee while ago, a couple decades ago. Although the language and tone of the current university setting are broadly Marxist, it is perhaps most helpful to conceive the radical predilections of the modern world according to the Gnostic paradigm formulated by Eric Voegelin. He's a political theorist, by the way. You don't need to have read him here. But here's what he says, which I think is really important. Gnostic dualism both despises the material creation and sees it as decisive. Those two things. It despises it, and yet it also sees it as decisive in forming the character and conduct of human beings. So that the evil that men do is not attributable to the sinful will of the individual. It's rather an intrinsic and hence inevitable result of physical existence. So physical existence is evil. The Gnostics regard the body as a prison house, right? The body is evil, the soul is good. It's in the prison house of the soul. You have to be liberated from that. It's also the position of Eastern philosophies, Eastern religions, right? The body is evil. It's a material object, or who knows what it is, but it's wicked just by being bodily. So there's a contempt for that embodiedness, the material creation, and at the same time, it's decisive. It's not your will which is evil. It's not your soul which is evil, it's your body which is evil, and you can't help doing it because you have a body. The only way you can help it is by getting rid of the body. How do you get rid of the body? Well, you kill it. It's a religious exercise. Now you can do this literally by taking your own life or somebody else's life, or you can seek to mortify the flesh in some way. But this aspect of Gnostic belief is reported not only by its ancient Catholic enemies like St. Augustine, but also by sympathetic contemporary commentators like Elaine Pagels. As I say, the author of the Gnostic Gospel is very popular in the 90s. And Harold Bloom would have regarded her. And so there are how many Gospels? I think there's something like 27. All told. I might be wrong about the number there, but countless ones. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the variety is of them, which aren't Gospels, by the way, but they claim to be Gospels, and they have the features of Gnosticism about them. They regard physical existence as the real problem, the real evil. And at the same time, the Gnostics also believe, and this is the final aspect which connects us now from the critical establishment to C.S. Lewis and his view of the conditioners. At the same time, the Gnostics also believe that those who attain to a special knowledge, or gnosis, that privileged elite, become part of an elite group who rise above the condition and destiny of ordinary mortals. Remember the abolition of man, chapter 3. Human nature is something that they condemn even while they share it, and they're going to experiment on others. And there are no limitations to that experiment because, of course, their nature, being superior, is more spiritual. And they are Übermenschen, so they're not bound by the laws and conditions of human nature. This will also be not just in the sciences, but in the humanities, the human sciences. So combine this with empirical science and technology, and the result looks very much like modern Marxism. The entirety of human reality, including the superstructure, so-called, of culture and society, derives from the material forces and conditions of the economic infrastructure, to use its language. That is of Marxism. Individual human beings and all their relations with their fellow creatures are thus products of physical causation. Materialism, the thing that I was just talking about yesterday when I was talking about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in Lewis's book on miracles, the materialism of his contemporaries, which he said was self-refuting because it denied reason, rationality, because rationality is not a material thing. So all their theories can't be upheld because they deny the very thing that's necessary to be proved to be true. But all of these things they see just as products of physical causation, which is why they're all Darwinists, by the way, because that's the Darwinist view. And Darwinism is just, again, a species of materialism. It just also has a sense of progress, evolution, the Nietzschean thing to it. As in the mythology of Gnosticism, with its wicked creator demiurge, the material world is an essentially evil place where the lives of human beings are reduced to a condition of miserable servitude to the necessities of physical existence. Yet again, there is the elite, now he's commenting about our own day, now comprising radical intellectuals and politicians, able somehow to escape the fateful determinism of material life and, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, forge a utopia in which all aspirations are realized, all desires gratified. So it's the Gnosticism that is the main academic project here. So this is where I think he's most correct. So when he says that they are at war with the word, he means it in multiple senses, but particularly with this religious impulse. And you would think it was anti-academic and anti-intellectual, which it is fundamentally, and yet it still has the trappings of elitism. And the desire to dominate, that is what Lewis described in The Abolition of Man. And to some degree, a degree of not of degree but of kind between the intellectual elite and the common people, the hoi polloi. Because after all, those are less intelligent people, so they're more physical and they're more limited and actually they're more poor than us. We're elevated from that. So there's this Gnostic sense in there, which ultimately the Gnostics are self-loathing because they still have bodies. In the end, they're going to want to kill themselves to be liberated from this terrible thing, or experiment on their bodies. But to regard it as at any rate as having nothing to do with their nature. So of course, transhumanism is a good thing. And so is, for that matter, gender ideology. So gender is the Gnostic impulse in its most virulent form. It's the idea that we are not limited by our bodies at all. Never mind our sex, it's our bodies. Because gender has no correlation to anything. It's just sort of, I would say, almost incidentally connected to sex, because they say themselves that sex and gender have no relation at all. So really what it is it's the postulate of the Gnostic belief about human nature that our fundamental nature is not physical at all, and therefore we can change whatever we want. Now the thing which is seemingly absurd about that is to demonstrate it, we're going to inject ourselves with all sorts of hormones to make us physically the opposite sex of what we actually are. But that will demonstrate our freedom from these things, not simply because we have control over it. Really, it's all about the will to power. And note that the scientists are doing it to other people's kids. They don't do it to themselves. This is bizarre insofar as I'm talking about literary theory, but actually that's where literary theory goes. And ultimately, that's why it works itself out in the academy. When I was a PhD at the University of Durham in the late 1990s, queer theory was a marginal discipline. It was not really influential at all, and now it is. The idea of gender identity was starting to emerge, I would say. Political correctness was to be thanked for that, because it talked about, not using he or she in relation to an individual. You talk about they, which in English we've always done to some degree, but then now it became the norm. You have to use they. When you're speaking of the author, you have to use they. You can't refer to the author as he or even she, but particularly not as he, because it would be offending the feminists. Oh, okay, well, I'll avoid that and use they. And so, but now I'm offending against the number rather than the sex, and that seems to me equally problematic. Anyway, but it's this Gnosticism which I think is the most helpful observation about this whole book. But the whole book is chock full of insights. I didn't even get into the new historicism, which I think is good, and you might find this really interesting, its idea of interpretation, constitutional theories and stuff like that. How do we regard a legal text? Based on these academic tendencies and the war with the word, how would we expect this to be expressed? I've already suggested the idea of the living tree. The Constitution is a living tree, so it's amenable to change, and whatever we want it to say, that's what it says. That's really where it goes. So there's no limitations. And then at that point, lawyers become godlike figures. Not just lawyers, judges rather. The Gnostics amongst them. The Gnostic elite amongst the judicial profession. But we're done with that, and we'll pick it up next time. If you have your